Hello. Yeah, hello. I hope നിങ്ങൾക്ക് കേൾക്കാൻ പറ്റുന്നു കരുതുന്നു. This is I'm not very familiar with this, Facebook Live. Uh, when I was asked to just, I hope someone would come and to see if you all can hear me. Uh, okay, good. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Okay. Anyway, so when I was asked to give a talk, I was just wondering, എന്തിനെ പറ്റിയാ സംസാരിക്കാന്ന്. നിങ്ങളൊക്കെ ഈ കോവിഡിനെ പറ്റിയൊക്കെ കേട്ട് മടുത്തുണ്ടാവും. And I had already given a couple of COVID talks. പിന്നെ എൻ്റെ ഫീൽഡ് ഈസ് ക്യാൻസർ ആണ്. So then I was thinking about cancer. അതും കുറെ I had given so many talks. So I thought ഒരു completely random ഒരു talk, that might be helpful, especially യങ്ങർ ആൾക്കാർക്ക്. ഇപ്പം നിങ്ങൾ ഇപ്പം ഒരുപാട് അഡ്വാൻസ്ഡ് ഡിഗ്രീസ് ഒക്കെ ഉള്ള ആൾക്കാർക്ക് ഇതൊന്നും വലിയ യൂസ്ഫുൾ ആവണമെന്നില്ല. പക്ഷെ യങ് സ്റ്റുഡൻസ് ഒക്കെ ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഐ തോട്ട് സംതിങ് അവർക്ക് യൂസ്ഫുൾ ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു ടോപ്പിക്കാണ് എടുത്തിരിക്കുന്നത്. എന്താ വെച്ചാൽ ദ ഗ്രേറ്റ് അൺനോൺസ് എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ നമുക്ക് സോ ദ തിങ് വിത്ത് നമ്മുടെ റാഷണലിസ്റ്റുകൾക്കും ഐ വുഡ് കോൾ ദ ഇറാഷണൽ പീപ്പിൾ ഈസ് ദ മെയിൻ തിങ് ഈസ് നമുക്ക് നമ്മുടെ നോളജ് ലിമിറ്റഡ് ആണെന്നുള്ള ആ ഒരു ഹ്യൂമിലിറ്റി ആണ് നമുക്ക് ഏറ്റവും നമ്മൾക്ക് വ്യത്യാസം ഉണ്ടാവുന്നത്. എന്താ വെച്ചാൽ the other people who are convinced they know the answers, they will never find the answers. So നമുക്ക് ആ ഒരു ആൻസേഴ്സ് അറിയില്ല എന്നുള്ളത് is one of the most potent thing in our life. So അപ്പം നമ്മൾ my initial talk in the title I was going to give ignorance is bliss, but that I thought is a little bit not the right one. Ignorance is actually, this is not actual ignorance, it's about kind of enlightened ignorance. What are the things we know we don't know, so that's a, and this is a very very kind of a very brief outline of some of the things that we know we don't know. Or I mean, there is so many things that are out there, so this will be a never ending talk. So this is a very short kind of a bird eye view of the things that are out there that we are sure we don't know the right answers at this point. Okay, most talks you must have, ipo ningal ketta talkuകളൊക്കെ കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് you will have lot more answers before you started. My goal is that after this talk, hopefully you will have more questions. Okay, so that is why my goal is that you will have more questions, and if there are students out there, I really hope there are, they will be finding some of these answers. Okay, and by the way, I'm a physician by training, and actually I do treat patients with COVID. So since that is a big deal right now, if someone has one or two questions, maximum one question, two questions, I'll be happy to answer that. But this is clearly as far away as from COVID as you can get. All right, so some of these questions that we are dealing with, so I am primarily focusing on about the universe, some of the big questions that people have been asking. This is not new. These are questions that has been humans have been asking since we started becoming, a conscious, intelligent entity. So these are like, where are we coming from? What is the universe made of? What is like the big questions are really not changed. Only the answers are changed. Karam, this is not a modern thing. If you look at any religion or any philosophy or any thing where humans do beyond the basic survival instincts and other things that every animal does, what separates us from the rest of the species is our this curiosity that separates us is basically in the questions, the deep questions, right? Now, I'm here not to answer the deep questions. I'm just here to kind of tell you where the current science actually has stopped. This is kind of like a, പണ്ട് ചെറുപ്പത്തിൽ നമ്മൾ പറയില്ല, ഇങ്ങനെ looking at a world map and looking for places that are not invented so you could invent. So it's like something like that, so kind of a brief overview. Okay, so just ഒരു 5 minutes on the history of the topic I am discussing is about, primarily about the universe, and how we found where we are right now. So just to get an idea, I think history is always useful, right? So history is something I never liked in school. I find it fascinating as an adult. കാരണം when it is taught properly, history is very enlightening. കാരണം നമ്മളെ പലപ്പോഴും history gives us kind of a background upon which we can build the future, right? So science history, the history of science is actually a talk by itself. And I would one day, if you all would allow me, would love to do that. History of all the major people who brought science to where we are now. We don't have saints and prophets, but science have the scientists that has made the world what it is today. People like Galileo and Faraday. It's thanks to Faraday we have all this, light and everything. So we should actually, or me or someone else who probably knows better, should give a talk just on the history of science. And but anyway, so just coming to this point, now the scientific method is like you observe something and you try to find answers, right? So in terms of looking at the universe, the ancients looked at the universe. So they found the moon, the sun, and they found the stars. And there were 5 planets they could see with naked eye. They only knew of 5 planets, right? So 5 planets, the word planet is coming from the Greek word planetes, which actually means wanderer. These are things that were on the sky that were moving. And they had all these strange ideas how they move. They had all this, angels pushing it and all these things. Because Aristotle, who had been one of the most influential philosophers for the past 2,000 years, his idea was for everything to move, someone has to push it. So this is one big idea that persisted throughout century until Galileo, first person to show that actually movement is the natural order of stuff. Stopping something, it requires friction. And that's a very fascinating idea. So the prime mover, Aristotle, is actually common sense. Science, some of the biggest ideas in science are thinking outside our common sense, right? So if you see something moving, you generally assume it need someone pushing it or it has to use energy. That is our common understanding. And that misconception was first, actually, Galileo was the first one to say, no, movement is the natural order of states. Number friction somehow movie don't. And of course, Newton codified it into a more mathematical formula. But until Galileo, people assumed someone has to be moving this planets and stuff. So the first model of the cosmos was actually the geocentric model. And this is something that dates back to even Aristotle. But the first person to really codify in the mathematical model was Ptolemy. Okay, this was called the Ptolemaic model. So many of you are familiar with the Ptolemaic model. So basically, what he found is that, or what his idea was, that Ptolemy was an amazingly brilliant mathematician and astronomer. So we now look back on him and we could make fun of him. But given the technique of the days, he had this model of so-called epicycles. Anyway, so that was the planets, all these things were moving in about 9 epicycles. That was the Ptolemaic model. Now, how good is the Ptolemaic model? Now, Ptolemaic model of these epicycles are still used even now. When you go to a planetarium, how the planetarium shows, the planets and the stars and all, actually is using the Ptolemaic epicycle. So, it is a fantastic model. However, what we found, and of course, all the religion, Ptolemy lived in AD about 100, first century. Okay, so the religions that were, that is now most of the religions that are now like Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, they came up with their cosmology not from some, like they got this, acidity. They actually, the people who wrote these books knew the science of the day. So they used the Ptolemaic model, so the Ptolemaic model was pretty good to explain what they could find during using their telescope, right? But then later on, when we had better telescopes and better, way to look at the universe, then they found that the geocentric model didn't make sense. There come our famous Copernicus. Copernicus, and the book is actually called The Revolution. On the revolution of the spheres. The word revolution until then were used to depict something moving around anything else, right? But the word revolution became something that now also means a very big societal change. Is actually partly thanks to Copernicus and the book, the pair adunda, because it was such a fantastic, amazing idea. Because our common sense is that we are standing still because no one feels the movement of Earth, but and everything is rotating around us. Now that was one common sense idea that made sense, but it didn't fit with observation. So it took Copernicus to actually come up with the idea that okay, no, we may feel the same thing, and the observation can be better explained if the Earth is static and the Sun is moving around, right? However, even Copernicus was fixated on the idea of the epicycles and circular orbits, right? So Copernicus actually thought the planets were moving around the Earth in circular orbits because circle was considered very special, kind of divine, and everything outside of the Earth was considered divine. So the Copernicus was still in that mindset. So he made his calculations on the assumptions that the planets are moving around the sun, which he got right, but he said it is moving in a perfect circle. So it didn't make any sense for later observations, if it was moving in circles. So then another important figure in this story of where we are now is an astronomer called Tycho Brahe. Okay, so he got a big grant from the king of Denmark at that time and built a big telescope, one of the biggest at that time. And he made some extremely accurate observations. So what he found was the planets were, so he didn't make the theory, he just found the observation. The planets were moving around the sun. He made a lot of fantastic observation, and then he hired a person who was much more mathematically skilled, and that was Kepler, right? So Kepler worked on the observation and tried to come up with a formula how to fit the observation with the theory, right? That is the whole scientific method. So how to fit the observation, the planets are moving this way, and how to fit this observation with the theory. So he tried and tried and tried and tried, and he couldn't come up with the right theory until he had this sudden enlightenment that the planets doesn't have to move in circles. So he thought, okay, why don't I make the orbits in ellipse, right? So when he turned it into ellipse, everything became so clear. The formula became so clear. So he was the first person to actually come up with the so-called planetary, the laws of motion. So until Tycho Brahe and before, people thought, of course, planets are orbited around in a circle. It was moving around the sun. And the third assumption of Tycho Brahe and people before was that the speed of planet was constant. All the planets were moving at the same speed. But the observations of Galileo, I'm sorry, of course, Galileo comes into this also, but observation by Kepler and the mathematics of Kepler found that the planets has to be moving in ellipses, and this is exactly a focal point of the ellipse to make the math work. And the farther a planet, the slower it moved, right? So these are the ideas that was the talk of the town in the 1600s, right? So there is this fantastic theory that explained the observation of the planets are moving in ellipse, and the farther it is away from the sun, it moves slower, right? So everyone was thinking, everyone means astronomers, physicists were thinking, if it is farther from the sun, so sun must be acting upon this planet some unknown way, and no one knew what. So one important figure in this story at this time is Edmund Halley. And Halley was a physicist and astronomer. And surprisingly, he had an interesting story that is kind of a sidebar. His family made a lot of money, so he didn't have to work. And the way they made money was his family was in the soap business. So they made soap. And this was a few years after the plague, and washing had become suddenly fashionable. So Mr. Halley didn't have to work a single day. So he had a lot of money to think about all the big questions. and he was fascinated by Kepler's ideas. However, he couldn't find the exactly what could be this force. So they were thinking about this, and he and a person called Leeuwenhoek, who is a famous person in biology also because he contributed to some other stuff. But anyway, so they were arguing and trying to figure out how to do this, and someone suggested, why don't you go and ask Sir Isaac Newton? He was not a sir by then, but he was already very famous as a brilliant physicist and mathematician. Ask him, maybe he would know. And he was in Cambridge at that time. And the story is that Halley went to Newton's place, and Newton came out with all this, chemicals fuming behind him. As most of you probably know, Newton spent most of his life on weird stuff like alchemy, trying to turn metal into gold, and looking for secret passages in Bible. And I mean, Newton clearly, if you look at the history of science, is probably one of the most brilliant person ever lived. I mean, he had such a incredible mind. He invented completely new fields of math and physics, but he was a little bit odd fellow. So he wasted probably more time on things that we don't really follow now than like alchemy. But anyway, so Halley asked him this question, and then Newton said, "Oh yeah, I had already had a formula how to explain it," and then he couldn't find it. So then I said, "Okay, let me do it again." So anyway, the long story short, he finally sent Halley a paper. Actually, it is called "On the Motion of the Bodies in Orbit." Okay, so it is first paper by Newton. And Halley was so impressed. He said, "Okay, let's publish it. This is fantastic." But then Newton actually got interested in this topic, and then the famous story of the apple and all these things. But anyway, so he came up with this book, which is probably one of the most seminal books in the whole of humanity. The Principia Mathematica. So another interesting story is that when the Royal Society wanted to publish it, they did not have the money to publish it, because the same year they had a competing book. They had to compete a book called The History of the Fishes. So the Royal Society could only publish one book that year, and they published not the Principia, but they published The History of the Fishes. So Halley, from his own money, actually published the book, the Principia, which actually really is essential in that Newton found the motion of the heavenly bodies and what is happening on Earth can be explained by the same formula. This is such a revolutionary idea. കാരണം അതുവരെ people are thinking heavenly bodies have to obey something completely outside of earthly things, that we could never figure this out. But his idea and his mathematics actually clearly proved that heavenly moments can be very well explained. Now, one interesting thing about Newton was he thought, or he correctly thought, gravity acts at far distances with no medium in between. And part of the reason Newton thought about this kind of strange things, which other scientists thought was strange, because until then there was no force that people knew of that can act without a medium. So when the mathematics worked, people asked Newton, wouldn't it be better to have some type of medium that you can't see, like an ether or something, to explain gravity? But Newton was convinced that when you put something like an ether, add some viscous or stuff, actually the math actually works less well. So he was correctly predicting gravity actually works at very remote distances with no medium in between, right? Now, part of the reason Newton could believe in those things was his predilection for believing things like alchemy. Alchemy is one of those pseudosciences, but what may sound strange is his beliefs in alchemy made him believe in like action at a distance without any media in between. And so that's interesting story about Newton. Newton reigned supreme for like a long time, until, I mean, even now actually most of the satellites and all we send to Mars and all can use Newtonian mechanics to send it correctly. However, when you look at things even more precisely, so every time what you find is in cosmology, in science, when you look things at even more closely, you find some discrepancies that doesn't fit with the existing observation. So like Ptolemaic model, almost 15,000 years, people were okay. And that fit with the model because that was the power of the telescopes until then. And when the telescopes became powerful, it took Copernicus to find, okay, Ptolemy was wrong. It is not geocentric, it is heliocentric, or it's around sun. And then Tycho Brahe found this Copernican idea of circles doesn't work. So it took Kepler to change it. And then Newton gave a mathematical formula how this all works. And Newton's formula and everything worked perfectly well until we had better instruments that showed some very minor inaccuracies in Newton's gravitational, it's especially the so-called perihelion precession of the perihelion of the Mercury, right? So these are very small, about 43-degree arc in a century difference in the so-called precession of the Mercury could not be explained by the perfect or elliptical circle of Newton. That's where, of course, our great Einstein come. One of the only other person who could stand shoulder to shoulder with Newton. So his theory was that, of course, as many of you know, that the space-time itself is curved and gravity is, big masses curving the space-time. So this idea, so when you use Einsteinian equation of relativity, you can explain the perihelion of the Mercury. So that shows that both Newton and Einstein was right about gravity, but the Newton's formula was not adequate to explain the accuracy. So Einstein's formula is more accurate, right? So this is where we are now, right? So this is where we are now. So Einstein formula is like one of the best or the most accurate formula even now. No one has really disproved it. It is shown to be extremely accurate in terms of explaining the universe. So now what we have found now is basing this, I think I took a little bit more time than I thought it will take to explain the history. So now we find that using Einstein's formula, you look at the observation, you look at these big galaxies, and you find that galaxies are actually spinning faster than what you can explain based on the amount of mass in the galaxy. One galaxy mass so if it is spinning faster, so ideally it should have more mass than what you can see, right? So what is this unknown mass? That is what we call as a dark matter, right? So right now, so the universe, what we know of the based on Einstein relativity, which is accurate as much as we can say, our observation doesn't fit